Myth. What do you look for in a book?
To me, it matters that the book I'm reading relates to real life.
To me, it matters that the book I'm reading it take me away from real life.
So you read Bell Jar for the Bell Jar?
Yeah, obviously. Cue the intro.
Only scans.
Kind of want to talk about what we're doing here.
We're dressed like some of our favorite characters today.
We are. Who are you?
I'm Wednesday.
And I'm
From
Enid.
Adam's family from the show Wednesday.
Happy Halloween month, everyone. Do you remember the old Addams Family TV show, the black and white one with Christina Ricci? That one has that iconic scene with Morticia and Debbie, where she's like, but Debbie really pastels.
I love Morticia. She's such an icon.
I grew up with the Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the original TV show. It was very popular.
I used to read a lot of Archie's comics growing up, which I would buy from my Raddiwala, because you couldn't actually get them where I lived.
Who's giving them to the Raddi? My dad used to buy it for me from a bookstore, respectable members of society.
Sorry, I'm not fancy enough for you.
Which does bring us back to the point I was trying to make is I personally grew up reading a lot of the classics. Huge Austen fan, Bronte fan. I also went to a Catholic school. I grew up in a very English speaking environment, more or less. And because of which I did gravitate more towards the classics and the Western literature that of that time that everyone I knew was reading, and that was also encouraged in the education system I was in. Dickens and loving Picture of Dorian Gray, way too young, should not have been reading that at that age, but I loved it. I also realized I didn't get to read a lot of authors of color or authors from different cultural backgrounds. I think you had a lot more experience reading a lot more diverse authors from a young age.
Yeah, I grew up reading a lot of Indian authors. I also went to a Catholic school. So I did read Jane Austen, but at home, my parents are big Marathi literature fans and also really big into Indian mythology. So I grew up reading Chintu or Amar Chitrakatha, Batatachi Char. And also my dad is a big history geek, so we had a lot of books from South Africa. For some reason, Russian books also, because my dad grew up in early 1980s. There was a lot of Russian influence, so I used to read these Russian children's magazines that he had. I know, I'm not even kidding. What I loved about reading Indian authors or South African authors a lot is it sounded very familiar because of our sort of shared history, realizing that I love reading about things I know and things that I can relate to. I feel like books really help me make sense of the world I live in and connect to humanity in a way.
I've always been, and I know you have too, we've both always been huge fantasy, urban fantasy, high fantasy kind of people, and trying to find something in that genre that was not entirely inspired by Western ideology, by Western aesthetics. We're very different readers, even though we share a love for a lot of the same genres and a lot of the same books. I think the way you and I approach reading is very different. That's the same reason I recommended Jasmine Throne to you this week, which is book, the trilogy that we finished reading. Jasmine Throne being the first book of the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri. I found it a few years back and I loved the idea of a high fantasy book that's very inspired by South Asian culture. And so this book essentially follows two main characters, Priya and Malini. Malini being the princess of our reigning kingdom, and Priya being a maidservant with mystical powers that she's yet to unravel. And the adventure that they set out on to balance the scales in this vast, dynamic, politically upheavaled land. What struck me was having two female characters, really well written, well fleshed out world, and a very interesting magic system.
Yeah. So, a little bit about Tasha Suri. She is obviously the award winning author of fantasy books inspired by South Asian history and mythology, like the books of Amba that you really like.
Yes.
And she was born to Indian parents in UK, and she studied English and creative writing at University of Warwick and also worked as an academic librarian at Imperial College
Ooh.
London, which explains so much.
So much.
You'll know when we talk about it. She's also queer, and so Jasmine Throne was published in 2021 in depths of pandemic in June. The book actually received a lot of critical acclaim because of its, lush writing, the decolonial approach to
Mhm.
fantasy, a lot of its complex characters, and sort of the depth with which he's able to write about morality. It also won the British Fantasy Award in 2022, as well as NPR's Best Books of 2021 list. And it was also nominated for World Fantasy and Locus Awards. So it was really celebrated for reshaping what epic fantasy looks like. I think Jasmine Throne talks so much about what it means to live in a colonized world. It's not only about land, it's about erasure of faith, about cultures. It also talks a lot about corruption of power. Both rulers and the rebels sort of start mirroring each other. The book is all about what happens when women refuse the typical road of sacrifice and silence, and what happens when they seize control through intellect, compassion, or even strategy. I also really love the queer representation and the love story. It's honestly terrible that they're falling in love. Like, it's really not good for them.
Yes.
Love can blossom in such unexpected ways, can still create something very beautiful in most unexpected times, and how transformative it can be.
Yes. And it makes you root for them. Like, oh, I really, really, really want this to have a happy ending. I think is so important because fantasy at its core is about escapism. It doesn't mean that fantasy authors can't have commentary on real world situations. The balance between that is so fine. And I think Tasha Suri does such an amazing job of carrying that through.
Yeah, and she's chosen the perfect setting to explore.
Speaking of setting, so we kind of start our story in the main kingdom, the colonizer. They are called Parijadwipa. This is the central kingdom surrounded by 5 kingdoms which make up the land territories. Malini, one of our main characters, is the princess of Parijadwipa. The actual journey of our story and the place where we meet our second protagonist, Priya, is a kingdom called Ahiranya, in complete contrast with Parijadwipa's grandeur and ostentatiousness. Ahiranya is kind of the forgotten backbench of the kingdom. It was very violently colonized and left in ruins, and it's become the hub of prostitution. It is also the house of the magic because the people of Ahiranya used to worship these gods called as the Yaksha, who were nature spirits, heart of the faith of the Yaksha, which is a mountaintop temple called as the Hirana, which is where Malini and Priya meet each other for the first time. And then surrounding Parijadwipa, we have 4 other quite important kingdoms. All these different places have quite distinct religions and cultures that they follow. So Shrugna is a smaller kingdom, and one of the defining things about Shrugna is they have this monastery known for its lacquer gardens, which is highly flammable and very dangerous place to live in. And that's where the monks choose to spend their lives. Next to Shrugna, we have Alor.
Yeah, and this is also where the nameless god is from.
Yes, so the nameless god is from Alor. Next to Alor, we have Dwarali.
We don't learn much about Dwarali in the first book.
Finally, we have the kingdom of Saketa, which is considered very different because the people of Saketa they are party people, and they believe in a good wine and a good meal and a good time. So Saketa has a very widespread royal family.
They have a big joint family.
My favorite detail is because in the books they provide a map in the beginning for reference. And so Parijadwipa being the center, the other kingdoms are shaped like petals of a Parijat flower around it. And they essentially form a giant continent in the sea.
Yeah, it's an island.
I love maps. I'm a big maps person because I think they really showcase how the author visualized. And I think I love the symmetry of it, and then it also has this magical element when you look at it.
What's that website you used to use? Like you made your own maps?
I think it was called Inkart or something like that. I've tried a bunch. This is why I have not published a book, is because I spend way too much time playing with things like this. If I do have to publish a book, I would need everyone to know it was because you held a gun to my head. There was an actual weapon.
I don't want to say I'd do it, but I don't want to say I wouldn't do it, you know?
But yeah, you are right. I'd forgotten all about this.
They were so like cool and descriptive, and I'm someone who like skip over descriptions type of person. I definitely like skip over like the wall looks like this, you know?
Annoying.
Because of you, I now pay more attention to fantasy book settings. The world this book is set in is so inspired by Indian history and mythology, but it sort of borrows different elements from different places. In general, it's inspired by ancient slash medieval India. Like there's no iPhones, guys. Okay. It's not that kind of fantasy. All fantasy must be medieval.
There is something very charming about escaping into a land where people have swords and shields and horses, and it just slows everything down.
So I made some notes about how Parjadwipa is early Rajput courts with its divine kinship, the jeweled halls, or saffron scented the food and all that, right? So when we meet Malini, she sort of arrives in this like silver chariot with white horses, and the cuisine, on the other hand, in contrast, which is like ghee rich dishes jeweled with pistachios and raisins. It gestures more towards what Mughal imperial kitchens used to be like, which was like more of an opulent ritual. And Arihanya, it's not Arihanya, it's Ahiranya, is sort of the empire's wounded shadow. Very lush, full of rebels, mystics, and impure gods. And people there mostly you see eat roti, pickles, a lot of like spices in their tea. The food is more endurance and not spectacle. Like there's a reference of a lot more preserved things, right? And their temples that are very sacred, like Hirana, is described as blackened walls by flame and time, much like a lot of temples that were defiled during colonization. And some of these statues are cut off, and there's like all of this destruction that still lives. So it really reminded me of that. And Arihanya's faith being older and more nature bound is so similar to what we read about in pre-Vedic times in mythology, where they used to worship elements rather than gods, which sort of came later on. So the Yaksha, they're the spirits of nature, of soil, water, growth. At first, this faith, like an antidote to Parajatdvipa's Mother of Flames, which is based on self-immolation. But Suri is very quick to unsettle that illusion that we learn about temple children, which are these blessed children who are taken from their families very early on by the Yaksa elders. And they have to go through these deathless waters, which are very scary waters that engulf you. And if you make it out alive, you're like once born person, okay? And then you come out second time, and it's sort of like the hierarchy is very short, but it's still there. So these kids are so used to death and sacrifice. Everything is a sacrifice to sustain the system of power that religion creates. It's not necessary that the Yaks are better than Parijadvipa's very orthodox religion. And I really like how the magic she showed with Yaksa is also like wild and life-giving, but is very extractive. The idea of hollowing, of how people have to empty themselves to give space to their gods. It really reminds me of very unpleasant things about our religion and culture. It shows you that magic is not always moral and that sacred doesn't mean kind. She really dismantles the fantasy of purity. Everything that is sort of a miracle, if hoarded and worshipped, can really curdle into consumption. So the rot is like a disease. It's a blight that infests people, mostly in Arihanya right now that we hear of, where it's life mutating through algae, like flower bursting from people. A lot of it is to depict how once the living magic that used to exist in Arihanya is now severed from its source. So now it turns on itself. So it's literally like you become Groot, kind of. but not in the fun, nice way. Tasha Suri has said that she sort of was inspired by that book, The Sick Rose, which is a tour through the golden age of medical illustrations. This book has really close details of what bodies look like infested. Overall, I just love her choice of using this as the backdrop. And it's really significant because we have a long standing maybe culture or trend, especially in the Western fantasy. They really use non-European spaces as something exotic. Like it's a throwaway line, there's one character from it. Suri doing this and presenting South Asia, especially India, as the center of this book really goes to prove how fertile our history and our past, our religions and faith is. And even with all of its contradictions, it can be used for, stories around power, around devotion, around rebellion.
I love how passionate you are about this. Every time I suggest a book to you, I really want you to love it, but I also sometimes want you to hate it a little because
You want me to have strong opinions.
yes, I just want you to have really strong opinions about it because it's super fun for me to then sit and hear about.
I have strong opinions about this. I'll tell you. Tell me why yaks are fairies. They're high
Yes,
fantasy
Indian fair representation you didn't know you needed. I can't wait for there to be Indian fair romances.
I don't think we need them.
Says the one person or two of us who's read ACOTAR.
I am a connoisseur of all type of things.
But
Garbage, bad literature, good literature. It's books. I'll read anything. I used to read the backs of shampoo bottles as a kid.
I know that about you. There's a reason why we read books I recommend.
Sometimes like the concept and not necessarily the execution, and I use the power of my imagination to make it into something beautiful.
Don't start with me. Don't start with me. I am moving on swiftly and immediately to I want to talk about what the book is about, which is Priya and Malini.
Characters. Love them. Okay.
So I'm gonna start with my favorite. Malini, Miss Malini, is princess of Parijat Vipa, only princess of Parijat Vipa. Her brother is Emperor Chandra, who is the poster boy for fascism and is a very strong proponent of blood purity and genocide. The Parijat Vipans follow the Mothers of the Flame. That's the religion that they believe in. It was 5 women who sacrificed themselves by burning on pyres, the fire embers of which were used to, at that point, defeat the Yaksha. These 5 female entities who now in turn demand sacrifice for power.
And they apparently have to be consensual.
The women who burn on the pyre have to want to burn on the pyre. But Suri also explores what does consent mean. The priests of the Mothers of the Flame are all male. They are curating the way that people engage with this faith system. And under this faith system, Malini's brother Chandra now demands that she participate in her turn of the self-immolation. Malini, our main character, refuses. And since she refuses, there can be nothing done but to push her into giving consent. So as punishment, she is sent to Ahiranya to be trapped in the temple of the Hirana. In Ahiranya, you have the Yaksha faith that has now that was now at one point flourishing with temple elders and abundant with children who were supposed to become elders. There was a fateful day when the Yaksha were destroyed and when Emperor Chandra sort of asserted his power. The last batch of temple children, and when I say children, I mean like infants to teenagers, were burnt alive within the walls of this temple
By the temple elders.
So Malini, entrapped in a temple, which was the site of about 20 children being burnt alive. It tells you the kind of world that Malini comes from. She's not soft or she's not gentle. Malini has all the makings of a leader, of somebody very comfortable with power.
How she looks is not who she is. All of her thoughts are very shrewd.
She's said to be beautiful. She's tall and slender and tan, dressed in beautiful saris, white and gold saris with a crown of flowers in her hair. She was named Malini, meaning the maker of garlands, brought up to be very pious. And instead, what she's become is somebody who has the grit to get out of any situation with an upper hand. And on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have Priya as our second protagonist. Priya is the most kind, transparent, honest soul who doesn't belong in this setting at all.
Very no BS.
No,
Will not bend for anyone.
she's straight as an arrow.
Yeah.
So-
She's a antithesis to Malini.
Extremely. She grew up on the streets of Ahiranya during the fallout of the Yaksha faith, and she got an opportunity to work as a maid in a noble household, and that's where she's been for many, many years, keeping her head down, very loyal person. So she has a whole lot of friends and people who love her and people who will stand for her. So you kind of touched on the rot, but the mythology of the rot, it would infect people who worked in the fields. It infected the body and made flowers grow out of the organs of the body until the person eventually died and became a tree.
But it's not contagious.
And the only way to slow it down is sacred wood from the forest, which is then shaped into beads. And it is so rare and so difficult to get. So, what we see Priya doing is going to the market, trying to beat the crowds and get some of those beads to then distribute it among the poor children who have the rot, knowing eventually the beads need to be replaced with fresh beads. She can't help but do it. That's who Priya is. It's unfair that Malini got her hands on Priya.
Hey, no. It's very sweet. Like, they're both two women who used to be very powerful and have since lost, like Priya being a temple child to no longer having any authority, and Malini from being a princess to essentially being a prisoner.
Priya was one of the temple children, and she somehow escaped the burning when it happened, along with an elder brother, since has disappeared and thought to be dead. Ashok, he left her in the care of our favorite character, uh, Bhumika, a daughter of a noble family in Ahiranya, who was also a temple child. Bhumika ended up marrying a Parijati general.
Yeah.
He's now the regent of Ahiranya. She is very quiet, very docile, pregnant with her child, very soft-hearted. So every rot-riven, poor, needy person in Ahiranya is quickly adopted into her service and so extremely loyal to her. Nobody knows that Bhumika used to be a temple child. Priya resents Bhumika for being more powerful and having a better life, not understanding that Bhumika is trying to just keep her safe. Also, not Bhumika telling Priya to stay away from Malini because nothing but trouble.
Yep. And does Priya listen? No.
Malini, she is dosed with something called as needle flower, which is essentially a sedative and keeps her unable to do much. Administered by her handler slash caretaker called Pramila. Pramila had a daughter who was one of the girls who burnt on a pyre.
She's grieving, so she is very bitter in general as a person. I hated her.
But it's like hurt people hurt people.
It is. And it also shows how religion can really indoctrinate people. She was okay with, her daughter dying. Even though Malini refused, they still burned. She could have stopped her.
There is certain scenes with her.
No, you feel for her. Yeah. I think her being there is kind of the reason Malini and Priya get closer, because
Common enemy.
there's a common enemy.
There is things happening in other parts of the kingdom while they're romancing in an abandoned temple. Our favorite trio, who deserves their own book series in our opinion, we meet a mysterious figure called Rao. We love Rao.
Favorite character.
Rao is a giant, cuddly warrior teddy bear.
He is a prince of Alor, whose sister was one of Malini's best friends who burned. A teddy bear?
And are you saying teddy bears can't be warriors?
I mean, I agree. He's like a little wounded bird in
He's-
my hand.
So Malini had two brothers, one of whom is emperor now, Chandra, an older brother called Aditya, who was supposed to be emperor. And Aditya grew up with Rao, childhood best friends. Rao is a lower prince. Aditya kind of found a calling in Rao's religion and decided to join the monastery of the Nameless God. We meet Rao in the first book where he's trying to reach Malini to rescue her. Prem is a lower prince of Saketa. He often comes to Ahiranya to party.
Man of many vices. Prem is like someone who would be in the TV show Entourage.
He is in cahoots with Rao. Rao is a man with a plan. And the plan is to get Malini to Aditya. That's all. This plan has no further steps. It has no preceding steps.
No, he also doesn't know where Malini is.
He doesn't
He
know how
has
to get to her.
None, nothing. And then we have Lata, the one
I was going to say the
sage,
brain cell of the group.
the brain cell of the group. They all share one.
They all share one, and it's Lata. She is academic. She is very knowledgeable young woman. Malini, once she befriends Priya,
She's like, I don't know her and I don't know what this is, but I know I can use her.
I know she can
And
kill someone, and
I
that's
know
what
she
I
can
need.
kill someone, and that's all I need to know. And obviously, she's attracted to her.
Priya agrees to go into town, meets with Rao, and Priya immediately dislikes Rao because she also thinks Rao likes Malini. Prem and Rao, not explicitly but implicitly, are a thing. Like,
No, that's not true.
yes.
That's you think I read between the lines.
Pry it out of my cold dead hands.
They're friends, okay, but there is like this underlying
They're friends.
tension. Moving on from one trio of madness to another trio of madness, we're introduced to Ashok, who we thought was dead. The way Priya sort of thinks of him so far is this tender but tough brother who's protected her from the evils of life.
Bhumika, who also grew up with them, has a lot more of a bleaker outlook on Ashok's approach and his ideologies.
Bhumika recognizes Ashok's cruelty. Ashok is the kind of rebel where the cost doesn't matter to him as much as the goal does.
But this is now going to enter spoiler territory.
He has an army of a lot of people, including children, who are drinking deathless waters to gain powers. And he wants Bhumika as well as Priya's support because Priya, when she was a temple child, had this like uncanny relationship with Yaksa. So he wants her to find these deathless waters again. Because deathless waters, they sort of appear to you. And that's when we sort of see that Ashok is using Priya's devotion to him as a way to get what he wants. And when that devotion doesn't pay off, he moves on to fear.
We also find out that Ashok is sick. He's not going to survive very long unless he can cross the deathless waters. In his mind, that's his only chance for survival or to accomplish his goal before his time's up. Ashok wants glory. That's the biggest difference between Ashok and Bhumika. Bhumika wants an outcome.
And Ashok's actions, because he is in such a hurry, that it forces Bhumika to the rebellion much quicker than she was expecting to. So we have an arc of a character which we don't see a lot, which is a pregnant woman who is going to war.
And I think, okay, talking about a very contentious character between us, Vikram. You do not like Vikram. I have a soft spot for Vikram. So along with Malini, Chandra sends, he's a
Santosh.
Santosh is a slime ball.
I hate-
Santosh is a horrible cockroach of a human being. He doesn't like Vikram because Vikram is not a pure blood high bond. I like the duality of Vikram as a man who has principles but also wants power because he wasn't given it. It wasn't his birthright. So when Ashok appears and starts taking active steps against the Parijati entourage, Bhumika is kind of forced to like step up, and that's the first time like Vikram sees what Bhumika truly was all along. It's so satisfying when he gets to see exactly how much influence she holds over his loyal and long-standing people.
What are they called? Like the Royal Guard?
Yes, they all work for
Jeevan?
her.
Jeevan is so loyal to Bhumika, he kills Vikram for her.
The war starts with the death of Vikram. We also have Rao and Prem and Lata who are forced to abandon the quest to save Malini and go in search of Aditya. They are followed into the forest by Santosh and his men.
Yeah, Santosh catches on to Prem's intention. So they
Yes.
have to escape into the night.
And there's a fight between them and Santosh, heart-wrenching battle, because we find out that Prem has the rot and he never told anyone. To save them, takes on Santosh and is killed in that battle,
And dies.
which provokes Rao to kill Santosh. And Rao and Lata make their way to where Aditya is, to now
Yeah. Rugna.
to
And also, so Rao is of the nameless faith.
So all people born in that faith are given a prophecy of the purpose of their life, and no one, not even their parents, know what it is.
So there's a very tender part where Rao tells Prem the prophecy. And the heartbreaking moment in the book, I cried. When Rao tells Prem his prophecy, it's a hint that Malini's fate is very tied to Rao's name.
It's beautiful and it's tragic, and I want Rao to have a happy ending. That's all I want. And you'll also notice we're not talking much about Priya and Malini. That's because Priya and Malini don't have a lot to do. They are stuck in
They're frolicking in the woods.
Yeah,
Okay,
they're
that's
stuck
not
in
all they're doing, but I mean,
Okay, they kind of are. And then when Ashok and his rebels attack the city, Priya and Malini get a chance to escape. They profess that they both are in love. We see their love story kind of come together. And then obviously, immediately as soon as this happens, as happens in every romance, they're separated by circumstances.
immediately, Ashok has to be the third wheel.
Ashok needs to know who his sister is going to marry at the end of the day. Like, Ashok has vested interest in the way this plays out. So,
That's not why he's there. He's
I-
there to kill Priya.
I know, but I'm going to pretend otherwise. Priya
Are
finds
you writing fanfic in real time?
this is what was happening in my head when I was reading it. Priya finds the deathless waters and she becomes a second born. But once they escape, the deathless waters kind of catch up to her. She falls quite sick. Somehow, through the telepathic link, manages to find a hut that we later find out is where two of the temple elders are living. Yeah, Chani and Sendil, the elders, they escaped, but they were not able to find the waters again. A lot of the other elders contracted the rot and have since become trees in this field. So the last of the elders are also dying.
And Ashok he's trying to get to Priya. And when he meets Chandani, he implies that Chandani might be Priya's actual mother. And that was like so shocking to me. I was like,
So a
And
lot
then
of
he
Priya's
kills-
magic they mention is because Priya is the only temple child ever to be born inside the Hirana, which is the temple. She has this ability, which is why Ashok wants her, because he wants access to the water to convert all of his followers into firstborn.
Bhumika shows up. And
Bhumika
Ashok,
and her army of misfits, and I love it. I love it. They're just willing to go wherever she's going. This kind of devotion that she's earned by being a kind and generous person.
and Priya sort of realize the inevitability of them having to go through deathless waters. With a war upcoming, they need more powers. And people who have already consumed deathless waters, this is kind of their last lifeline because they die without it.
Priya summons the deathless waters, and all of the rebels and the temple children go into the waters, and Ashok does not make it because Bhumika stops feeling him or being able to sense him in the Sangam.
It's heartbreaking when he dies. Like the end of this book with Prem dying and then Ashok not coming back from the deathless waters, Suri doesn't make it easy for us to digest this rebellion and the cost of war, even when it's for a just cause.
It doesn't spare people because they're good, because they're righteous, because they have people who care about them.
Yeah. And this is also the point where Priya and Malini separate. Malini goes to Shrugna, where Rao is already there and him and Aditya are waiting. This is when you meet Aditya. He's the star you're sort of waiting for because he's supposed to be the savior of everyone, right?
It's very anticlimactic because Aditya has no desire to actually leave the monastery and overthrow the empire.
Yeah, and like Chandra sent soldiers.
I think that's the point where Rao and Malini kind of looked at each other and went, "Oh no."
Bro, And I think to a certain extent, both of them knew that Aditya wouldn't be the typical, maybe, like he can try the best he can and then we'll be his aides
So
to take over.
Malini is convinced that she can convince him. His desire is not tied to kingship, it's tied to his sister.
Yes. But I will say that Malini doesn't agree to it because she thinks Aditya, or what I believes in Aditya, is because she knows she can wield more power if he's
That
the
is
emperor.
That is true. The king who will come is not Aditya, it's the Aditya Malini paints him to be. Parijat Vipans to coming to the monastery, and like I said, it's a
Yeah,
lacquer.
they're like seeing them from afar.
Yeah, it's a lacquer garden. So it's Malini's idea that we leave some people behind who are visible. Aditya has to
He has to fire the first.
he has to fire the first arrow.
It's not only he hesitates, but him and Rao are both baffled that Malini suggests it.
Yes.
Malini says, like, you guys hold your morality as some sort of a treasure when this is misplaced.
In a dark forest, and she's surrounded by men and who are looking for guidance, who are looking for direction, and Malini at the helm of it, saying, but she says, I am a descendant of Divyanshi, I am blood of Divyanshi. I was christened at the feet of her statue. She picks up his arrow, she picks up the fiery arrow and shoots it at the lacquer garden, setting the first flame. From the beginning of Malini surrounded by burning pyres of her childhood friends, refusing to be part of that fire, being imprisoned in a temple that was a site of burning children. She's surrounded by these violent iconographies of fire. To her, at the end of the book, claiming that iconography.
Yeah. The contradiction of the priest trying to burn her at the beginning of the book to her burning the priest.
The garden burns and the Parijati soldiers are perished, Rao declares that he has to announce his true name. So, just pulled up the book real quick. So, Rao says to her, when she is crowned in jasmine, in needle flower, in smoke, and in fire, he will kneel before her and name her. He will give the princess of Parijat her fate. He will say, name who shall sit upon the throne, princess. Name the flower of empire. Name the head that shall reign beneath a crown of poison. Name the hand that lit the pyre. And all of that, the prophecy that he's talking about at the end of book one, is that Malini has been prophesized as the rightful heir to the throne, the rightful queen of the empire. And so everyone, the entire army, has no option but to kneel to her. And Aditya is more than happy.
Mm-hmm.
He's, in fact, I think, the first.
He was waiting for this. Mm-hmm. And they all chant her name.
It's book
Which was very nice.
Book one ends with Queen Malini, long live the queen.
Very like Daenerys-like support.
Yes. We are officially at the brink of the war.
Yeah. This book, like, remind me so much of, the succession wars that happened after Shah Jahan died.
Yeah.
So in Mughal Empire, any son sort of has a right to the throne. So there was a lot of infighting between Aurangzeb, Dara, and Jahanara Begum.
Jahanara.
And she was a very, very powerful woman. She had her own palace she lived in. And she was called Lady of the Age and everything. And Suri talks about how she has sort of drawn from her, along with some other, important women from the Mughal Empire, to talk about how much power they wielded and how it is very un-European and very specific to this history.
Yeah.
To have that sort of arc. Chandra, Aditya, and Malini. So much like Aurangzeb, Chandra is very conservative, religious, very ruthless. Malini says this, I know you don't know Aditya, to Priya. She's like, I don't know if you know Aditya, but I can tell you that he's not an idealist. And idealists are by far the most dangerous rulers, which is kind of what is commonly a notion held about Aurangzeb, a very pious, religiously fanatic ruler. So Aditya, on the other hand, sort of reminds us of Dara, who was more liberal and open-minded and was supposed to be the emperor according to Shah Jahan's wishes, but doesn't become one. And Aditya mirrors that because he goes and becomes a priest of the nameless god in Alor.
Yeah.
And he is the shadow that falls on the book because he's someone that we are trying to find the whole book. Like Siddhartha, before his enlightenment as Buddha, after looking at his palace, sees all the luxury and the order and witnesses like a death procession, and this suffering makes him really uncomfortable with his life, and he leaves, right, to seek enlightenment and also very similar become a priest. So Aditya's choice feels like this awakening, but you don't feel good about it. He is morally opposite to Chandra, who's literally burning people to prove purity. But Aditya, on the other hand, is seeking a god that literally has no name, like no hierarchy, literally like no temple. But it really makes you think, in a war-torn world, is withdrawal peace or is it more privilege? So there is a sense that you feel he's escaping rather than withdrawing into priesthood. So that really makes you uncomfortable. And so when you look at Malini, she obviously reminds me of Jahanara Begum because Jahanara never married. She had all this like
Yeah.
extraordinary power. Fun fact about Jahanara, she actually designed Chandni Chowk.
Yes.
Malini doesn't stop herself from manipulating people. She will lie about the girl that Priya killed. She will use every face that she can put on. And I love when she looks at Priya, although obviously I think she's attracted to her and there's a romance arc. The first thought she has is, I can use her.
Yeah.
So to Malini, like love, affection, even faith is a way to manipulate to get her way. So that's why I love when she says, I still live despite faith and flame.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because Malini is named after Draupadi, right? Garland weaver. Like Draupadi, who was famous for being caught in impossible situations, who's like derobing in the court publicly, started Mahabharata. Malini's refusal to burn begins this rebellion.
Yeah.
So Malini is resilient like Draupadi, and she's also very authoritative, the way one would imagine Jahanara Begum to be. Priya's journey is like much quieter than Malini's, and like Priya is everything that is not important to the empire right now. She's empathetic, she is like a commoner, she's poor, and she's stubbornly alive. And the way Malini described, she had these cat-like eyes, a crooked nose, and she was strong and unlovely, and you couldn't put her in different clothes to make a high-born woman out of her. Like there is something about Priya that is so different from Malini, but that's what is attractive to Malini.
Love. There's the line where Priya lies to Pramila and Malini taunts her saying you should learn to lie better. Because Priya can't hide the feelings that come to her in the moment.
They fall in love like a grotesque place.
Yeah.
The way the temple is described is like stone and ash. It's basically both of their tombstones. Priya should have died there.
Yeah.
And Malini will die there. They see humanity in a place where none existed so far. In the ruins, like somehow, like the most radical thing here is when love is rooted in empathy, in recognition, it can become like a form of political rebellion.
Dissent, yeah.
Their love pushes them. Like there's a lot of contradictions. Like this is not the only relationship. Like when you look at Bhumika, who's one of our favorite characters, Bhumika, who's pregnant at this point, like her body is literally like producing new life as she plots demise of an entire empire.
Yeah. Bhumika's approach to battle is I want to replace the thing that's causing damage. It's a difference we largely see between the way that men and women look at objectives of power structures.
Suri shows us how the most ordinary men can create extraordinary cruelty. How just people doing very small things and contributing to a system has led to this. Santosh is such a perfect example. It shows you that empire doesn't really need villains, it just needs few people to listen and to follow. So Ashok is like corrupt idealism. Both Ashok and like Chandra are similar and different in that way that Chandra is obviously a fanatic, but Ashok thinks he's better than that. Yes, you want to free Arihanya, but at what cost? And the cost to him, like, he's very easily persuaded. Like his moral conviction becomes brutality that he's not able to see. Let's talk about my favorite character. Rao. He makes the active choice of being part of this rebellion. He could go to Alor, be a prince, it'll be fine. Aditya doesn't really want to be an emperor either. He could abandon his destiny. Whatever. I don't know. But he's such a devastatingly human presence in this book. It breaks my fucking heart. He's just lost his sister. He's lost Prem. He's like kept moving on. Like there's a sentence where like he thinks to himself, he steeled himself and moved forward in the dark. This whole book, this man suffers so many blows. And he's someone who knows so much in a way, but also feels the most purposeless in the book. Because Malini knows what she wants, Priya sort of knows what she wants, but they don't have this sense of impending doom the way Rao does.
Rao and Priya have this kind of parallel ship.
Yes.
They both carry so much hope. And every time it doesn't pan out, it doesn't matter. They keep carrying that hope for something better, for something more. Both have this kind of will that makes them do things out of love. They're the most desperate form of love, which makes your heart ache for them. They have this kind of, they have a rooted belief that this love will pan out.
I think a lot of Priya's desperation comes out of her trauma, right? Like so much of her life has been betrayal from her family. People that she trusted the most, that were closest to her, betrayed her. So it's also about being able to see herself as something bad.
Yeah.
When she becomes the most magically powerful person, and we learn that magic is something, that hollows,
Yeah.
but also something that heals.
Yes.
And Priya becomes this representation for it. So, how can someone who is a lifelong healer now practice and heal when it will hollow and it will hurt? And what is a third path for her? And Rao, yes, he's a warrior, he's trained like Aditya, but he is like the soul of this book.
Yeah.
And because Malini can't really have a priest, she's
Yeah.
not a faithful woman, Rao is the closest we get to Malini having a high priest, I think.
Yeah.
Because
He's
Rao
her
is
advisor. And
he's her advisor.
in a way,
But
like
not necessarily a strategist.
no, he's the soul of the book, right? And Priya, I think, is the heart of the book. Like they're both, because Malini is not an emotional person. We established that through all of her decisions. They become like her emotional advisors. They become her connection to humanity.
And there is something so lovely about how Malini makes an active choice to keep loving Priya. She has so many thoughts of Priya at all times. Is so cute and is so it makes me giggle.
She also uses Priya a lot like her compass of what Malini deems acceptable and unacceptable based on what Priya would and wouldn't approve of.
Yes. And Priya is Malini's only vice. Priya is the one thing Malini is doing that to her is selfish.
Writes her
She's like-
love letters in the middle of a wartime.
Yeah, she's like everything else is for a greater cause, but Priya is for me.
Priya is willing to sacrifice everything because she has faith and she wants this for her people, except for Malini.
But the unfortunate truth here is that Priya would sacrifice herself for people who she loves, but Malini would only sacrifice herself for Priya
That
and
too-
not other people.
that too in a very specific set of circumstances.
Yeah.
Because if it's up to Malini, the first like 85% of what she does is try to like
Save
find a workaround.
She's like,
Right.
what if none of us die? How about that?
Exactly.
Priya is like, let me just die now.
Yeah, Priya's first step is let me die,
Then figure it out.
figure it out. I love them so much. They are the truly, not only are they the romance of the book, they're a little bit the comedic relief of the book.
Priya is definitely comedic relief. Remember, so Bhumika has this, like, I don't know what to call it, Khalida? She's like, someone who's a little rude to Priya, and she goes, I hope the rats eat her hair. That's a literal dialogue.
Yeah. Priya makes no bones about her honest opinions on things. Malini makes no bones about her action. If I don't get the kingdom, I'm lighting it on fire. And that is, encompasses who she is as a person fully.
Bhumika is halfway between who
Yes.
these two extreme people are. And you notice that Suri does this a lot, like this triadic structure with relationships. So a lot of the novel is built to mirror these trinities, right? Like you have Priya, Bhumika, Ashok, the three siblings, but they're the three different visions of rebellion. Priya wants to heal, Bhumika wants to endure, and Ashok kind of wants to burn the world clean.
In a lot of ways, Ashok and Chandra, while antitheses of each other, literally in the political climate, are very similar because they, like Ashok, also believes in his divinity very strongly. He believes that all the people that are dying for his cause are dying in service of the Yaksha, which is fine by him, is just as strong as Chandra's belief that the women that he's sacrificing on these constant pyres are connecting him to the mothers of the flame. And in the similar vein, I think Malini and Bhumika not only want something better, but want something better out of their participation.
Yeah.
They-
It's also because they're not commoners, right? Like Bhumika is someone who was also part of some sort of an aristocracy in Arihanya, and so was Malini. So they know what it means to have power. They are the
Yeah.
most knowledgeable about, and they're both women, so more overlooked. So they have the most knowledge about what it means to rule because they see it very up close.
Getting it to work for them requires a lot of fight to
Yeah.
actually get access
It's,
to it.
they still have to go against the whole system.
They-
All the system is corrupt and all of power is transactional. You see that with Chandra, Malini, and Aditya too. The anatomy of rulership, domination, which is what Chandra does, abdication, which is what Aditya does, and reclamation, which is what Malini
Malini
does.
does.
So they all become the sort of fractured empire.
I always think Aditya and Priya are mirrors of each other in the same system of triadic siblingship. Priya and Aditya have a very important place in this system that they don't want. She has this connection with the Sangam, with the Yaksha, that she doesn't necessarily know if she wants because
She spends a lot of time not to be in the spotlight.
It's like Aditya's purpose to him is service to the nameless god. Priya always only her ambition extended to her service to the people.
Very
Where-
reluctant leaders, Aditya and Priya.
Reluctant leaders, women who want to claim power they were not readily given, and leaders who don't understand the impact and the depth of power and what it means to have it.
Yeah. And you also have Prem, Aditya, and Rao. Prem is sort of the beating heart, and Rao is, I think maybe Rao is like the consciousness
I
of the
feel like
trio. And then Aditya is the soul.
I feel Prem is way more impulse because
He is someone who thinking with his heart. He's like a very emotional person.
Prem,
Yeah, that's why he goes on this whole thing. He's doing this as a favor to Rao. Like he believes in Aditya, but
yeah,
what it is he believes in Rao. And he dies for Rao.
that is true.
Versus I think Rao, he's someone who has such a strong conscience
Yeah,
that he's doing this because he knows what's right.
that's true.
And I think of Aditya as a soul mostly because that's what he's interested in. Like he's so introspective that in this trio, that is the only role he could possibly have.
Get it.
And you know what's really sad is when you take Prem away from it, you feel that Rao is now like there's an incomplete part of their friendship between Rao and Aditya.
We see
Well-
Ram struggling with it.
Yeah, where Rao is like balancing to be the heart and also be the conscience
Yeah.
of this. Like he's like, how do I love and also follow my path? Which
I
is
love
really
that.
difficult.
I love that. I hadn't thought of that. I absolutely love it.
Isn't that really sad? There are no tears left to cry. Okay. Like Ariana says. I feel like a lot of Suri's brilliance in her lack of willingness to simplify a lot of this resistance, like how intergenerational and collective any rebellion is, and how it almost always comes with, a side of tragedy, and how history isn't necessarily always made by people who win, but rather who endure.
I love the way that she never sets out what conclusion she wants you to make. Right? Like she doesn't go around and explain exactly the ins and outs of it because in honesty, religion is something that evolves with the way people interpret it and the way people connect to it.
Like Mothers of Flame stood for sacrifice,
Yeah.
and they use this as the last way to defend their people. When you look at Chandra and when you look at what followed in Parijadvipa, you want other women to follow in the sacrifice when the whole reason they self-immolated is to avoid sacrificing their people.
Especially in religion like Hinduism, we do hear a lot of things like, oh, our religion isn't oppressive because we pray to goddesses and goddesses form a very integral part of the pantheon. But the worship can't be used to oppress real women.
Yes,
Eh,
like looking at women as something divine and pious dehumanizes them. And
Exactly.
that's exactly what happens with Malini. Like Chandra views her as something pious and divine that it needs to burn.
She becomes an offering to the god. She's no longer a person. Like the difference between her and a garland of jasmine flowers burning on the pyre is negligible.
She's literally called a garland weaver. She is supposed to be an offering. There is so much like beautiful descriptions about Malini's clothes too.
Even the men, like, first of all, Prem, I can talk about Prem's fashion and his like wardrobe for ages.
The colors are so vibrant, like the peacock feathers, the muslin fabric. You look at Bhumika's, her room in the palace
Yeah.
is like a rose garden. It's called Rose Palace. How she describes Hiranyaprastha, how she describes like the dirt in the city
Yeah.
in Hiranyaprastha, where it's literally like people have just given up and now it's just like they put a fence around the trash.
Yeah.
How Priya almost gets killed in a stampede in the first 3 pages to get something. Everyone in the book loves chai.
Yeah.
Even Balini, Priya, every single person, no matter where they're from. Who are we without chai as
So,
people?
Priya comes back after a long day. She's sopping wet and she goes and sits next to the cook and has chapati, pickle, and chai. It's
Yeah.
so me.
Cardamom.
Yeah. And then also at the end of the book, when we go to Shugna, where the monastery is, it's beautiful.
Very simple.
Yeah, it's a safe house for them in the moment, but it's made of lacquer. It is the place where a decision has to be made. I think like had Shugna been a palace or a fortress where they could, stop for a while, you would lose the sense of urgency.
Yes. And also, that structure is so representative of how faith is.
Yes.
It's a monastery built of lacquer which burns very easily and very fast. And that sort of temporariness that you have around religion in this book in general, like the disappearance and the reappearance of God, the sacrifice, everything, like how quickly things change, really shows you how fickle it is, how fickle faith is, how fickle belief is, and how quickly it can transform.
Yeah. It's also indicative of the characters too, because Aditya is so comfortable being there. He's been living there for a certain amount of time. He's comfortable being there, so are the priests. Malini's first thought on entering is this lacquer? Like she doesn't want to be there a moment longer.
I also really like how Suri makes an active decision. Yes, there is graphic violence. There is no sexual violence against
Yeah.
women in this book.
I agree. I love that.
And you don't even realize it. I started thinking about Game of Thrones when I was reading this book because of the obvious like fire and the Daenerys connection. And I realized no one's getting assaulted in this book. I love that this book takes like it's an active choice, obviously, because almost all of fantasy has it. Like there can be so many important stories about rebellion, about trauma without this component.
Agree.
It's a great read for people who are uncomfortable with that being used as the only source of conflict, pain, and self reflection. There are so many other things that can create character arcs. So I love that. And I also love there are so many characters that you see this world through. You sort of build a puzzle, but I don't think it's confusing.
It also creates a way more complex world for you to immerse yourself in because nothing is surface level. There is depth to everything, whether it's expressed or implied. And it
Yeah.
kind of brings us, full circle to the wonderful world of Tasha Suri that we've decided to dive into. Well, so this is a very long review, as you can tell, because we don't agree on everything. We have our very different favorite parts between the two of us. So, okay, to conclude, Jasmine Throne, book 1 of the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri. What do you rate it on our rating system of top shelf, middle shelf, bottom shelf?
I definitely think it's top shelf. I would give it a solid 4.5 out of 5.
Ooh.
And I'm taking away the 0.5 because some deliberately slow pacing in the beginning of the book. I wish we got to know more about the other cities in the kingdom.
I agree. Big top shelf for me too. I would give it a 4 out of 5 because I would want to see a little more happening with Priya and Malini in book one. They got a little sideline. I feel like, especially when we talk about Dwarali and Shugna a little bit at least, but Dwarali and Saketa in general, we don't see much of their culture. We're kind of done for this segment, and we will be back with part two. If anyone is currently reading this book, or if we inspire you to read this book, let us know the name of Pramila's daughter and let us know if you like this. And we promise to keep getting better.